I'd like to introduce today Russ Vaagen from Vaagen Brothers Lumber. And so from my aspect, having grown up in Spokane and making occasional trips north of Spokane through Colville, always was fascinated, especially as a child, with your mill there at Colville. I mean, you could not possibly live within 50 miles of Colville and not know about the mill that you folks have there. I was impressed when I met my wife 22 years ago and came out to visit her in South Dakota and walked through her garage, and it had open roof trusses, and all the stamps and all the lumber was Vaagen Brothers. And I'm like, yes!
That's cool.
So maybe you can give a little background about the mill there and some of your background. And obviously you've got sawdust and splinters in your blood. So I'll let you jabber at me for a while.
Well, thanks, Mike. I appreciate you having me on. Yeah, my family's been in the forest industry and lumber production world for most of the last century, actually. My great-grandfather homesteaded Northeast Washington in the late teens, early 20s. And then he was a Swedish immigrant and knew a thing or two about sawmilling, and so would start setting up these small sawmills around these homesteads and kind of became known for it. And then he had all girls with one son, and unfortunately his son died in World War II. And one of his son's best friends actually married his daughter. Well, that's my grandfather and my grandmother. And so my grandfather learned from his father-in-law the sawmilling trade. And then with his help in 1952, they started Vaagen Brothers Lumber. And so it was really humble beginnings, about 15 miles east of Colville, where the first sawmill was created near the homestead. And they cut mining timbers, railroad ties, and lumber for a long time, and really built the backbone of the business on federal timber supply. That coming out of World War II, especially in the West, was a real push to try to get economic development going, especially in the rural West, and the housing boom that was going on at that time. So then my dad kind of got pressed into service because my grandfather unfortunately died in his 50s. And so my dad took over. His name's Dwayne, in the 80s, and grew the business along with the federal timber supply. And then unfortunately, we had a pretty big shift with the spotted owl and the timber wars. And so that federal timber supply started to dwindle. And so our mill enterprise had grown to 3 mills and 500 employees in the 3 northeastern counties of Washington State. And with that timber supply going down, a couple of mills, the one in Ione, Washington, and then another one in Republic, ended up shutting down just because of lack of supply. But that focused all the efforts on Colville. And a lot of people remember Colville for the portal crane that's in town. And so it's a small northeastern town that fortunately has a lot of manufacturing here, but it has a 128-foot tall log crane that kind of comes right out of the valley floor and handles logs every day. And so we get people that just stop and look at that. And so that's a kind of the icon when you described going through Colville and knowing that. We get people actually from all over the country that reach out to the mill and talk about the crane, and as they drove through in their RV or they were doing something and they just were mesmerized that they could, park at Walmart across the street and just sit there and watch this crane move back and forth and pick up entire truckloads of logs at one time. And so it's been a really cool thing to be part of. And in the early 2000s, I came back to work for the family business after spending some time in Western Washington, buying logs and learning about the business, and then spending a little bit of time in sales and marketing and traveling to different clients that used wood, not so different than Hanson Buildings there, and seeing how the lumber is used for trusses and for different components of everything from commercial structures, agriculture to residential. The sawmill business produces typically 2x4s, 2x6s, and 2x8s, a little bit of 2x10. So it's a pretty standard commodity. The interesting thing about Vaagen Brothers is that the focus is all on small logs. So I described that kind of growth, and then the kind of black swan event, which is the timber supply of the federal forest dwindling. But because we pivoted towards small diameter focus at the time, we were really able to work with the environmental community and the community at large to thin our forests and to utilize the small and medium-sized trees, leaving bigger trees to stay on the landscape as a seed source and be a continuing forest all the time, as opposed to clear cutting and replanting. And so that got us a lot of favor with the community and the environmental groups, and we were able to talk the Forest Service back into thinning and restoring these lands and using that material more as a byproduct than as a focal extraction from the forest. And I think that resonates with a lot of people. And because of that, Vaagen Brothers was able to grow. In 2006, there was an acquisition of another small diameter mill in the area, about 50 miles away, in a little community called Usk, north of Newport, Washington. And it makes primarily studs. And then in 2011, we acquired a former Pope and Talbot mill in Midway, British Columbia that had been scuttled. And we took what was a traditional large log multi-line mill and converted it into a single pass small diameter saw line like we'd seen in Colville. And so that spurred on some growth, which was not a lot of small family-owned businesses were able to grow during that time. And that was, from the 2000s into the 2010s. And there were a lot of challenges with the economy around the 2008, 2009. And, being a small business, we pivoted to producing product for the Australia, New Zealand market, which for some reason, different global forces, they didn't experience the global financial crisis that the rest of the world went through. So their currency, which traditionally trades in tandem with the Canadian dollar, was very high, actually eclipsed the US dollar for a while. So we focused on producing product. When lumber went down to, and it's hard to say this today with lumber prices, but when lumber went down to $188 a thousand, we were shipping 35 million plus board feet annually to Australia and New Zealand, and converting what is a 2x4 to a 90-35 millimeter size, which is really close but different enough. And so that time I was vice president of Vaagen Brothers, and I was head of the operations, working with my dad Dwayne and the rest of my family. And then we've communicated a little bit about it, Mike, but in 2016, I started another business, and I actually stepped away from Vaagen Brothers. It's still held by my family, but I started Vaagen Timbers to make glulam beams and cross-laminated timber. So I take the product that's made there at the mill that I'm so intimately involved with, and now we turn those into mass timber products. And it's a new, interesting evolution for lumber and timber and all of us, I think, because now we have these large wooden panels that are made with lumber as opposed to veneer from plywood. And it's really interesting how it's allowing us to tell our story of the forest and all the great things we're doing into the urban environments now. We're building I was actually on a call earlier today talking about a project we're doing in Brooklyn, New York. And, you know, in the past with lumber, as you know, being a commodity, you don't typically, unless you're buying large volumes, you're not that connected to the sawmill that it came from. You might see the stamp on the wood or the paper wrap that it comes in, but you might not be directly correlated with the actual manufacturer. Now, because of this mass timber movement, that we're making these cross-laminated timber panels, glue-laminated beams, columns, and glue-laminated timber panels, we're actually communicating directly with the architects, builders, developers, and some of the code officials in these communities. And so I'm really excited and bullish on where wood is going in our buildings and markets that traditionally was just steel and concrete. So it's a fascinating time to be in the wood business, and yeah, it's a cool transition to see wood going from this old industry that's been around forever, that everybody just kind of knows it's there, but kind of drives by and doesn't think much of it, to now this kind of high-tech, new age building material that takes the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and the energy of the sun, creates these trees. We encapsulate it in lumber, and now we're storing carbon. So everybody looks at it as this carbon storage opportunity to lower carbon footprint when we're building with wood, when we've had it all along. So we're pretty excited about, whether you just love wood because it's a great building material, or you have environmental concerns that are driving your purchase decisions. The beauty of wood, that it answers both of those things.
Well, and I can sense your enthusiasm for what you're doing, and of course I'm fascinated by anything that you can do with wood. And as you were telling some of your story, it was I'm having these flashbacks of my grandfather, who he was a builder in Chihuahua in the early 1930s. And so he was in all likelihood probably building with lumber that was produced by your ancestors. So
without a doubt, yeah.
Yeah, it would be pretty hard for him to have been a builder in Chihuahua and not have been using your family's wood. So
yeah, and for those that don't know, on a map, I mean, that's literally 20 miles from Colville, and it's the same, basic range of mountains and everything that I grew up in. So absolutely.
Yeah, and because we have a client base all over the country, if you have not yet visited Northeast Washington, plan yourself a trip, do some camping. I mean, it is beautiful country. There's nothing I can say that's going to adequately describe it. So I know we've got a lot of people that will be viewing this, and because of what has happened in the lumber market in the past year, people are trying to wrap their heads around what has occurred and where we're going from here, and maybe you can give us some insights that
yeah. Here we are now, as we're doing this recording. We're in the spring of 2021. We're about almost exactly a year from the initial shutdown of the economy, if you will. And so it marks about a year ago when we had the shortage of toilet and tissue paper. I mean, I'm sure everybody remembers that. The lumber industry, it was fascinating, because when that happened, your business either got tagged essential, or you were kind of in this holding pattern. And I tell this story because it's applicable to where we are today. So what happened with toilet paper is that the whole logistics model was predicated on buying behaviors of the consumers. And so consumers would go to the store, whether it was a grocery store, Costco, Walmart, what have you. And, they had it figured out to where every seventh shopper bought a package of tissue paper, right? And so the inventory models and the warehousing was all predicated on that. Well, when the pandemic started, everybody said, you know what? I don't know how long I'm going to be at home. I don't know what's going on with this thing. I need essentials. Well, essentials are toilet paper. So we didn't have any more consumption of toilet paper. We had a movement of the material, which created shortages and in some cases, price increases. But it basically just moved the inventory from distribution to the consumer base to people's homes. And so what then happened with lumber was interesting because all the sawmills, because they produce the feedstock for tissue paper, were deemed essential right off the bat. Forest products, essential. So the interesting thought was, well, if the sawmills are running and the building industry isn't going, then the lumber prices are going to go down and people are going to produce less lumber. And there was a little bit of that. But the interesting thing was that building centers and lumber yards were all listed primarily across the country as being essential. And so everybody was at home doing their projects, the over the shoulder, as we call it in the lumber business, the going into Home Depot, Lowe's, your local lumber yard, and picking up 2x4s, 2x6s, plywood, OSB, that hit record levels. And so all that production that was going into wholesale distributions for companies like Hanson and others that use a lot of lumber, that inventory was dropping and not being replenished because people were uncertain. But at the same time, that was diverted over to Home Depot, Lowe's, the box stores, and all the others. So that production was all consumed, and everybody had assumed that the lumber was going to end up being long. We were going to have large inventories of it. And then when we started to do building again and the economy going, it would all work itself out. Well, what happened was those inventories, because of uncertainty, weren't replenished at the wholesale and the distribution level. And then we came out of the pandemic and everybody essentially started where they left off all at the same time. And so there was all this, like right back to where we were at a consumption level, which 2020 was playing out to be a very robust economic year. And so you had a lot of projects that were already funded and going, and they're all starting up at the same time. And you still had a continued pull from the box stores because a lot of people were still staying at home. So those two things really disrupted that whole supply. There wasn't a whole lot more that the lumber industry could do to supply that and to move that inventory in there. And so you saw a lot of panic buying from people that were building, stick frame apartments and single family. And of course, a lot of people at the time decided now is the time to move out of the city into rural communities. And so you had single family housing on the increase, you had multifamily projects that were funded and all the other things that were going on. And it just created a real shift in the supply demand. So demand was really high, supply was static, and everybody said it was a lumber shortage. I look at it back to toilet paper kind of like that. There was no real change in the production of lumber products. There was a change in consumer behavior and where the inventory was. And so that took us, if you look at the Random Lengths composite average, a year ago was just starting to come up a little bit. It was about $400 a thousand for standard lumber pricing. This last week, it posted down, I think, $10 from the high of $1,044 a thousand. So, you're talking, to put that in perspective for some people, if they, don't know lumber, you go from, 40 cents a board foot to well over $1 a board foot. And so all of a sudden, you have projects that take, hundreds of thousands of board feet of lumber that need material. It's not available to them because it's already all being spoken for. And so they're ordering that. They know they've got another project going. So they're now doubling up on their orders. They're ordering from mills and they're ordering from their wholesale distribution chain months out. So the order file grows. And so there was a lot of focus on moving product and the consumption of that product. And I've talked to a few folks that believe that what we're going to see is, some people, because they're like, hey, we need more lumber, they're buying on an order basis more than they need. And there's other constraints like logistics, trucking, getting the material from point A to point B. And so people are continuing to add to their order file. And at some point, we will catch up. Either there'll be a slowdown in demand, or the supply will creep up and meet it. And at some point, some people are going to have more than they need, and then that's going to reduce the demand, and the prices are going to come down. The question will be, is that going to come down in a steady way, or is it going to crash back down to levels that are the historic trading range? I don't know. I would guess that what we're probably going to see is a few stair steps down and then some testing, just like you talk about the stock market. And it's going to develop a new trading range. I think that, I don't know how you would look at it, Mike, but I think our trading range historically was, I think for the last few years, 350 to 450, 1,000 for like a composite average was pretty much what you could expect. You had some blips in there seasonally or different things, but that was kind of the trading range for lumber for quite a period of time. And, we'll see. I think it's funny to say this, but, $600 to $700 1,000 lumber looks pretty good today. And so who knows where that trading range will be, but I tend to think now that people are used to higher prices. There's a lot of pressure on things that, the new trading range might be, $500 to $600 1,000. And, we'll just have to see what comes of it. At some point, these supply demand curves shift and things happen, but I don't see it being a shortage of lumber as opposed to buying behavior of the consumers, both the wholesale marketplace that's moving a lot of commodity volume and the over-the-shoulder volume. I think that it shifted and it upset what was a very tight, just-in-time inventory system that people were used to for a long time. And that shift has caused these prices to go to levels that I don't think any of us expected to see, at least not this early in the process, the evolution of lumber prices. We all know things go up in price over time, just because of inflationary issues and other things. But $1,000, that was typically relegated for hardwood flooring and other, high-end items, cedar and some other items that, you'd see those numbers. And as a lumber guy, if you were selling, you kind of salivated. Now you're seeing those as standard, in some cases low grade. So it's pretty interesting.
So from a production standpoint, looking at a big picture of, say, North America, how close are the mills to being able to are we close to 100% capacity? Is there the ability to produce more than what's already coming through the line?
The capacity is growing. There are constraints. There's only so much wood that's coming out of the forest. So it's not like Vaagen Brothers, for instance, can just go put another sawmill line next to the one in Colville and feed it. So you have those constraints. That said, the Southern Yellow Pine market has developed and grown significantly. At the same time, you see the Western Canadian beetle kill epidemic really slow that capacity down. And it's not ironic that those companies look to the South to invest and build more mills. So that's kind of been a wash. But I will say that, with these high prices, you're seeing profits for a lot of these sawmill companies. They are not sitting on their hands. They're making more investments, building more capacity. They're going to eke out a little bit of incremental gain at every sawmill they have with better technology and better equipment. But you're seeing announcements in areas where they can get log supply, where new sawmills are coming online. And most of that's in the South. I do believe that now our federal government, based on what we've been able to do here, and the fire danger issues, that there is a new push to manage federal forest lands and grow that marketplace too. But that's not a short time horizon. It's a longer term. It takes, years to plan these things out and execute. So I would say, getting back to your question, are we at 100%? We're probably pretty close, but that 100% will be growing incrementally as we go. So there's more lumber coming online, and we're producing more lumber. And I'm not looking at those stats, but I would say the feeling is that if a sawmill can produce lumber, it's producing it. So you're going to see record levels of production at a per sawmill basis across the board, and you're going to see continued investment. So I think that, yes, you're going to see more product. The problem, though, is what we talked about earlier, is getting that product through the channels out to the marketplace, because people are already behind. So it's this kind of catch-up provision that's going to take place. And then is that going to be 3-4 months, a year? We don't know.
Well, and that's the beauty of the building industry, is that none of us have that crystal ball, and if we did own the crystal ball, we'd probably be using it to do things other than produce and use lumber.
Yeah, that's true, and I think anybody that has a crystal ball isn't telling us they have
it. No, they've got it well hidden and put away. So, and the challenge in the building industry right now is that we're at a pace where we're attempting to build residential units at just breakneck pace, and trying to pull something out of a hat that just isn't there. When everybody's running their mills, as trying to get as much product through it as they possibly can, and the end users are still trying to run away and hide from them, it really makes a push me pull me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I don't think we know what true consumption is right now. I mean, some people do that are really studying the data, but the question is, will the music stop? And will all of a sudden the trucks show up, the deliveries to the distribution centers and the wholesale lumber yards and to the users all pile up at the same time, and everybody goes, whoa, okay, I've got enough, and then prices fall? Or do we incrementally get closer and people go, okay, I've got more confidence now that I'll be able to get the lumber for this project, so I won't be so aggressive on ordering. I've talked to some people that are in that wholesale distribution model that are supplying apartment builders and home builders and all these folks, and they're reflecting that they're hearing things that say, I don't care what it costs, get it here. And that's why you saw prices go from 400 to 700, then 700 to 1,000, and in some cases, I mean, we bought MSR for our process that was, $1,400, $1,500, 1,000. A little bit higher grade, but it's been tough. I tell people, boy, I sure picked a really good time to go from the selling lumber to buying lumber mode. So we've learned it the hard way. And, it's interesting too. We have such a commodity industry when it comes to lumber in North America, and not all other markets are that way. In Europe, the produces specific products for their clients and types of products. Where here, everybody just produces a 2x4 or 2x6 or 2x8, and it's to a grade. And then if you're a user of it, you figure out what you can use of it. So it's interesting because when you get that demand, the price just goes up. And the counter to that, prices will come down. And, it's just a matter of, will they go down the way they went up, or will they, stair step? And we just don't know. And there'll be forces that, just like a pandemic, that come in and do things to a marketplace that are unforeseen. And those, we'll figure out what those are in hindsight. But I think that people are going to keep pushing, keep using wood products. I think the other thing is that you're seeing a lot of squawking by folks for the price. But it's interesting, in our product, we're pretty new. Cross-laminated timber buildings is, if you haven't heard of it, it's not surprising, but if you have, it's still pretty new. And it's a lot more wood in a structure. And so people associate that with being expensive. But I was sharing with our sales team, I said, we had a project that we bid on. Ultimately, we weren't the successful bidder, but our bid price for the cross-laminated timber and the glue lam to go into this project was just under $500,000, which is a hefty price tag. But then I read about more in the project in the local paper where it was going. It was a $19 million project. So, the percentage of cost of wood in structures it's not that it's de minimis, but it's not as big as people think. People think we build homes, they're all out of wood. The cost of the finished value of that home, lumber itself, structural lumber to build it with, has never been over 5% of the cost. So I think we have an unrealistic viewpoint of the effect of lumber. Your choice of fixtures, cabinets, and countertops are likely going to have as big or bigger effect on the budget of your home building project as the lumber that you use to construct it. That's not to say that what was a $20,000 item that becomes a $40,000 item isn't a big ouch. It's just interesting to see how that dynamic goes. And I think when these things happen, it breeds innovation and people look at it differently. In our process, we utilize the three-dimensional modeling, and then we take that and hand it off to a CNC unit. And when we deliver a building package to somebody, there is no cutting on the job site unless somebody made a mistake. So everything is pre-cut. It goes in almost a prefab manner. A lot of times we take and put the connection hardware on there, so it goes off the truck in the order it's being constructed. And to give you some context, we did a 3,400 square foot home in January here and you probably remember where the little Pend Oreille lakes are. It's about 3,000 feet of elevation, real winter there. It's a climate that gets probably 3 to 4 feet of snow and lots of wind and cold temperatures. We started that build. It had a footing on there. We started it January 11th, and in 5 days, we had that structurally completed. And so the contractor's now working out in an environment to frame the interior walls and do the finish work in a season where you couldn't have framed. And so it's pretty interesting how fast that goes. And we even cut the entire staircase. We made a 7-ply CLT, and then we put it on our CNC, and we cut all the stairs out of it. And we took, to people that build, they know this, we took and delivered to the site the staircase picked it up with a grade awl with a picking hook on it, and set that in place in less than 30 minutes that it arrived. So I know there's some pretty good people that can cut stair treads and build staircases, but that's a pretty amazing shift to go from the time it takes, the material, the cutting, and all that, to just dropping in what is a necessary evil to now being a centerpiece. It's this really incredible looking mass timber staircase. And I think that smarter use of our wood products is going to be what comes of these really high prices.
Yeah, and I follow a lot of the work that you folks are producing, and it's, I mean, I have a real appreciation for anything out of wood, but a lot of it looks nothing short of miraculous. It's fascinating to me to see what you're able to do, and that you've got a team with the vision in their heads to basically realize that their only limit is their creativity.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. And one thing that you had hit on here about the small percentage of wood that actually goes into a normal residential home, and we have seen over the past few years in the post frame industry a huge migration of potential clients where we've gone from, well, we were doing garages and shops and some commercial buildings to well over 50% of our inquiries now are for people that are looking for post-frame homes specifically. And
Yeah.
a fair number of these people have this concept of, well, they're going to save 50% over what a stick frame home would be. And I'm like, you might want to have a slight reality check, because just like you said, all those interior finishes, they're all going to be the same. You're going to have to insulate the same amount of surface and drywall or other interior finish the same amount of surface, and you still have cabinets and fixtures and floor coverings, and we had nothing to do with any of those things. And whether you do a stick frame home or a post frame home or insulated concrete blocks or pre-engineered metal building, the only thing you've changed is that structural system, and that structural system is really such a small piece of the big pie.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's one of those things that, it's consumer behavior. Sometimes it's not rational. And, and it's kind of like people that like to tell you they got a good deal on something, or it's interesting. I mean, people's perception is going to shift their purchase behavior, and some of it will be logical and work out, and some of it's just going to be that's what they decided to do, and they're right. And that's sometimes it might work out for them, and they maybe figured it out better than some of the rest of us. But other times it's I always, in my time in business, I've noticed that sometimes you start something new and you work at it. And I'll bring up an example. I used to buy logs in places where the log price was depressed. And, it goes back to that story I told of the shift in the federal timber supply. We had to find logs to keep these mills going. And we tried to keep the mills going as long as we could. And we'd find logs in places where they didn't have the same infrastructure, and we would ship them to Colville and Republic at one point. But it was always a loss leader, right? It was never the cheap log. And a lot of the other manufacturers, because they saw us doing it, and I think there was a perception that these are cheap logs and they're going to show up at the mill cheap, that we had a lot of people that go, okay, well, if Vaagens are doing it, we ought to be doing it. And next thing I know, I've got competitors from different parts of the world competing to buy logs in these far-flung places to put them on rail cars and ship them to the sawmills. And I always thought, that's interesting. I wonder if they, their log price locally is different. And what I realized in my unscientific kind of evaluation was it was this kind of copycat. Well, they are doing it, so it must be working mentality. And that's a lot of times what shifts behavior. And so if somebody sees somebody else building a pole frame home, they go, well, I liked it and they must have it figured out, so I'm going to do it too. And sometimes it doesn't have to play into, rational behavior. And sometimes it's a trend that stays. And sometimes like those log markets, they shift and, you don't bring in those loads of rail wood anymore. So, I don't always, I tried to figure that stuff out when I was early in my career. So there's got to be an answer. Sometimes there's not an answer. Sometimes people just want to do things because they saw somebody else do it and they said, that's the way I'm going to do it. And away they go. And sometimes it changes and shifts for the long haul, and sometimes it's short-lived.
Yeah, well, I've heard that with what's considered like new technologies, that there's about 10% of the people that they jump right on it just because it's something new and different. But the majority of people are making the decision based upon emotions rather than necessarily a rational judgment. And it's we're fascinating people as human beings.
I agree.
Well, we've chewed up about 45 minutes here, and so we probably should start heading towards an end. But you're doing some great stuff out there, and I applaud you for pushing the boundaries, getting code organizations looking at, wood doesn't have to be in 3- and 4-story buildings. We can go beyond those points, and we can't grow more steel and we can't grow more concrete, but we can grow more wood.
Absolutely. I was watching the virtual mass timber conferences going on as we speak, and I saw an architect from London, and he gave a presentation. He's a friend of mine. I've gotten to know him over time. He's probably the foremost architect of mass timber in the world, if not in Europe. He had an image of a handful of seeds, tree seeds, and he had a building that he built. He said, this is the amount of tree seeds it took to grow the trees for that building. And that's a powerful thought when you talk about growing more steel or concrete or what have you. The fact that we're harnessing the power, which it's Mother Nature's solar power plant, which is a tree, which is taking the energy from the sun, water, and nutrients, and creating this wonderful building product. If you manage it properly, we can grow it in perpetuity, and we can store that beautiful wood inside the structure and enjoy it. It's a really amazing thing. And those of us that have been in the wood industry a long time and love wood have always thought that. And I think it's just we're welcoming a lot more people to the party, I hope.
Well, I hope so too. My dad being a framing contractor, and his 5 brothers were framing contractors, and I was brought up with wood is good.
Yeah, so, I would just say, before we wrap up here, Mike, a group that we belong to is called Woodworks. I don't know if you guys are familiar with them, but they are proponents of anything built with wood. And so if you've got your audience out there trying to figure out what the heck is this guy talking about with CLT and mass timber, Woodworks is a wonderful nonpartisan group that's funded by manufacturers. It's funded by the Softwood Lumber Board and others. Got wonderful information on their website about these different projects and product types. And so if anybody's interested beyond just, visiting our website and looking up what we're doing, which we encourage people to do, Woodworks is a really great resource. And if you have, architects or designers or engineers or developers that are looking at that, that's a great resource to look at other building types and information on how to learn more.
Yeah, and I agree. I know that we have consulted with Woodworks several times on some more involved projects that are maybe outside of what most of our industry would look upon as being the norm, and we. Considering that we're in a box that would be considered as post-frame construction, I think we tend to try to push some of the envelopes there as well, and look at trying to find ways that are more practical and more efficient, better use of products to get into end users a building that ultimately will best serve their needs. And so I applaud you and your work, and I'll be looking forward to seeing future interesting and neat stuff. I see a lot of it on LinkedIn. So if those of you who are listeners, if you're on LinkedIn, take a look at some of the things that's happening there, and I think you'll be just as excited about it as I am. I really appreciate that you've taken your time to speak with me, and I'm sure that the audience will appreciate your insights as well. And it's been fun.
Yeah, well, thanks, Mike. Hey, and I appreciate all the stuff we've shared back and forth on social media. It's a great tool, and if your audience is using it, get out there, learn some things, and feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. And you go to our website, which is VaagenTimbers.com, or as you pointed out, we're very active on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, the normal places. And I have my own YouTube channel as well, where I post things on there, both for business direct purposes and other things that we're working on that we find interesting. So appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, Mike, and your audience. And if there's anything we can do to help you or anybody watching, we'd be happy to engage.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Mike. Take care.
You too. Bye.